Well, good morning and welcome back, everyone. We are on the second lecture of the bioethics course for the cellular and molecular biology masters. So always begin with a little prayer. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful and enkindle in us the fire of your divine love. In the name of Christ our Lord. Amen. Okay. So, welcome back. Several things for you. First of all, this one is the Ethical and Religious Directives for Catholic Healthcare Services. It's got a long title, and it's the title is almost longer than the booklet itself. But we call this Ethical and Religious Directives for short, and just ERDs for even shorter. All right. So, in science we're into acronyms. So ERDs is this little document is used a lot actually in Catholic healthcare, and it pretty much defines the bioethics for us from the Catholic perspective. All right. This publication comes from the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, so the 170 or 200 dioceses there are in the United States. I don't know how many. In coordination together, all the bishops, they had this published, of course, with a lot of consultation with different scientists and doctors and sociologists and theologians, etc. This is the fourth edition already. I'm sorry, the fifth edition. Okay, and it has actually gone to, when these documents are done, they go to the Vatican to get Vatican approval and everything else. So this is pretty much the official teaching of the Catholic Church with regards to healthcare. Considering that about 1/10 of healthcare in the United States is Catholic healthcare, between hospitals, nursing homes, rehab centers, and all that, it's about one-third, maybe 10 to 15% of healthcare in the U.S. as a whole. And this little document is supposed to be binding for all Catholic healthcare institutions in the U.S. And just very briefly, I want to point out the contents on the inside. It's divided into 6 parts, 6 mini chapters, if you will. And each part or chapter follows the same format. The format is kind of a dual format. First, each chapter has a little introduction, which is 1 or 2 or 3 pages long. And then there are what is called directives, starting with Directive 1, for example, on page 8. Right? See, Directive 1, Directive 2, etc. Each directive is a paragraph, sometimes just a sentence, typically a paragraph, and it's very specific, all right? It really drills down on specific issues, so on and so forth. So each one of the 6 parts has the same structure, if you will, all the way down to Directive number 72 at the very end, okay? Then, of course, there's an introduction, a general introduction, and a conclusion. And then at the very back, all the references, all the notes, right? It's end notes, and even an index for specific topics. Then, looking a little further into the table of contents for a moment, on the first page itself, the preamble and general introduction, okay, but then the 6 parts goes more or less like this. First is the social responsibility of Catholic healthcare. In other words, the commitment, it flows from the gospel of healing. Of course, the leader of our faith is Jesus Christ, and we can say that he is the healer, right? What did he do? When he was here on earth in his lifetime, he healed physically and spiritually, which is very significant because we consider also what we call the integral vision of the human person, body, mind, and soul. And this is good to know also in the medical practice, because as you go into medical school, typically you may end up in a Catholic medical school or not, okay? But not necessarily you're going to get that integral vision of the human person. And it is just the nature of medical schools to really zero in on the disease and the diagnosis and so forth. And sometimes it's missed that that foot is actually attached to an organism, to a human being, all right, who also has a mind and a soul and feelings and beliefs and so forth. And so what we call the integral vision of the human person is really considering body, mind, and soul as a complex unity, a complex whole. So derived from that, then that's why sometimes Jesus is called the divine physician, all right? The divine physician, because he heals body, mind, and soul. And so from there flows a social responsibility, a social commitment to heal from the Catholic Church, all right? And that's why the Catholic Church is so big in healthcare, Catholic healthcare. Then the second one is, the second part, pastoral and spiritual. Pastoral means mostly the availability of the sacraments for people who are Catholic. You know that today in any hospital, even secular hospitals, I don't care, Jackson, for intake, all right, as part of the documentation of intake, they will ask you, would you like to state a religion or a belief? It's voluntary, but they ask the question. And if the patient does state a religion or belief, then the institution, Jackson, has chaplains who are either Catholic or Protestant or Jewish or imams. They have Muslims, they have Buddhists, you know, that will come and service their patients because it's part of that vision, and I think it's commendable. So that's the pastoral and spiritual part of it, all right? Also putting it up front to give it priority, really. And there even, it's documented now, there are clinical literature, there are articles in the medical journals, all right, in medical publications that talks about the disposition, the spiritual disposition of a patient that can affect their physical healing, their physiological healing. One direct connection that has been made time and again is between spiritually well-being and a healthy immune system, to the point where people do not feel well spiritually or emotionally, that will diminish their immune system and expose them to more infections. That for a hospital setting has implications because of the superbugs, right? MRSA and stuff like that, which is very real. That's why 24 hours after having heart surgery, they stand you up and they walk you. It's amazing. And 3 days later, they try to kick you out the door. So it's real, all right? So the spiritual component, really, I'm not going to belabor it, but I can emphasize it enough to be respectful of it, because it can actually enhance the healing process. Then it's getting it more specific, beginning with part 3, the patient-doctor relationship, or they're calling it professional-patient relationship, because it also has to do with nurses and other, social workers and other healthcare personnel, even the administration at times, has contact with the patient. So that relationship is really, it's sacred, it has to be honored, and there's confidentiality and stuff like that going on there, okay? Part 3, then part 4, now it starts getting into the big areas of bioethics, like I explained at the beginning. Bioethical issues at the beginning of human life is part 4. Bioethical issues at the end of human life is part 5. And then finally, part 6 is on partnerships, because this little document really is binding at the level of institutions. All right, we use it at the individual level by analogy, if you will, but this is an institutional document. All right. For example, I don't know if you heard of Mercy Hospital in town. Mercy used to be Catholic, now it was sold, but the system that it was sold to, which is a national system, it has about, I think, 150 hospitals, something like that, throughout the U.S. They also have Plantation Hospital, for example, in Broward. And more recently, they bought Kendall Regional, which is way up west on Berg Road in the southwest area, all right? Well, this system, which is private, for profit, okay, has decided to maintain the Catholic identity of Mercy Hospital. It's their option, okay? But really, speaking quite frankly, it's a higher standard that could cost them real money. Because, for example, to give a specific example, in part 4, you'll see we as Catholics take exception to in vitro fertilization, which will be another lecture. But that's one of the most profitable procedures done today in healthcare, okay? For couples who cannot conceive, or anybody really at this point, because it's legal. It's very profitable, you know, to the tune of $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 for each attempted implantation. And Baptist System, for example, has a huge IVF clinic in South Miami Hospital. And we take exception to that, so it cannot be done. And that's real money that is not being earned by the system. Okay, so this comes at a price. But that's the whole thing about doing principle ethics, which is what we do based on certain values and principles that are foundational. And so on and so forth. In part 5, for example, obviously you're going to hit into physician-assisted suicide, which again will be another lecture. And you may or may not know, but it's already legal in 8 states, 7, and then the the DC, which is not a state, but it's a district. But in 8 states of the US, out of the 50 states, it's already legal, physician-assisted suicide. And again, we take exception to that. So that's another procedure that is not done in these institutions. And it gives you all the reasons of why here. Finally, 6 is on collaboration, precisely because there are certain procedures that we may not do. Then when there's a collaboration between a Catholic hospital and a non-Catholic hospital, all right, which is becoming more and more the mode, that collaboration has to be carved out and crafted so that it may not be 100% fulfilled collaboration because of these ethical issues. And so what are the limits to that collaboration, institutional collaboration? And they call it partnerships in a language that is more understandable. But that's really, technically in bioethics, we call this cooperation, formal and material cooperation, which are ethical classifications, you know, participating in an act that has both good and evil coming out of it, all right? Like an ectopic pregnancy, for example, how do we deal with that? And again, we'll have another lecture. So as small as it is, this is a bombshell, you know, talking about the canons. This is very succinct. And it's a quick reference, and they made it like this on purpose because professionals, they carry it here. And if there's a doubt or a question, well, let's look it up and see what the church is saying about this issue anyway. So this is my little gift to you folks. You can consider this the unofficial textbook of the course. All right, but keep it, and I hope that you can put it to good use in your professional life. All right. Now, questions, comments? No? All right. Let's go to the summary then for a moment, just to do a little review. And you see how I scribble there my comments, right? So let me erase that here. And we only went about halfway through it. It's all right. But I'm looking again for key concept, keywords. This, of course, cannot be concerned about too much of grammar and syntax. This is not a writing thing. This is more to feed me back what you've gotten out of the lecture, okay? And I can tell already that there are a couple points that I need to review. And also the language, then it's important because what I'm looking is for key significant words. It's part of your vocabulary. And forever in medicine, one is learning vocabulary, right? Which sometimes is very technical and specific, but important. So, okay, in bioethics, just introduction to bioethics, to keep in mind that this is an emerging field. It is interdisciplinary, all right? Not just philosophy. Some of you told me, oh, it's part of philosophy. Yes and no. In other words, the ethics part is a branch of philosophy for sure, but the bio, strictly speaking, is not philosophy because the bio is evidence-based, all right? It's empirical. And therefore, it is truly interdisciplinary, right? It has to reach into this both worlds of the nature of the empirical world, and then the rational, the ethics brings in the reasoning process, if you will, the analysis, all right? But keep in mind that it is interdisciplinary, and therefore it needs that dual competence, if you will. With regards to reproduction, fine. People know how it is. You understand. It's just sometimes it's a little more difficult to actually write it out, right? To express the thoughts in the language. But basically, it's to what purpose? In other words, keep in mind this basic principle. Form follows function. Did I talk about form follows function last time? No, didn't I? Okay, so nature has a bunch of principles, if you will, or that we can observe, right? One of the principles is known as form follows function. Form follows function is a basic dictum in nature. That means that the structure of the thing is according to the function of the thing. It's important here not to put the cart in front of the horse, right? Because then the horse has to push the cart, which is very awkward. It's the horse that goes in front of the cart. In other words, it's all about functioning. What is function in life, in biology, in nature? What function are we talking about? And we can focus it from healthcare at the level of the organism, in other words, the patient in front of me, and at the cellular level, those two levels, okay? So the level of the cellular level, which is the basis of life, organic life on Earth, is a cell, right? But the cell doesn't live by itself in vacuum, it's in a context of either a unicellular environment or a multicellular organism. So the key word here is metabolism. Metabolism is functioning, is body functioning, right? So you have cellular metabolism, and when you put all those cells together, the trillions of cells that form our bodies, our human bodies, going through the hierarchy of organization from cell to tissue to organ to system to the entire organism, then you have metabolism as a whole, body functioning, right? Which is medicine, the concern of medicine, is the proper body functioning. So form follows function. That function is metabolism, body functioning. The form, the structure of the organs is according to the function of the organs, and the systems likewise. Okay. So form here, we have to interpret it that this was put together by non-philosophers, by scientists, by empirical scientists. So when they talk about form, they're really talking about shape. In science, form is actually shape or structure. Okay. In philosophy, for example, form has a different meaning than shape. Because just to give a very simple example, here we are 5 people. There's no doubt that we are 5 human beings who belong to the same species, okay? But as far as shape, we have 5 different shapes. With respect to everyone, we have 5 different shapes, okay? We have 5 different shapes, more or less, within a range. But we have one form, which is the form. The form is humanity, human being, humanness, the species. That's the form, okay? So philosophically, a form, there are many different types of chairs, many different shapes of chairs, all right? But if we go to Australia, and I presume no one has been to Australia, maybe you've been to Australia, I've never been to Australia, but if we go to Australia and we see a chair, we say, oh, chair. We recognize, we've never seen that chair before, but we know, because why? Because we know chairness, we know the essence, we know what it is to be a chair. That's the form. So there's one form for each species or type, right? Which is the essence, the substance. And then there are shapes. In fact, grammatically, it matches, because what is the substance grammatically? Grammatically, in a sentence, what is the substance called? Give you a hint, the substantive. What is the substantive? In normal English, the noun, chair, table, ceiling, sky, planet, universe, right? So the noun in the sentence is a substantive, that's the technical name for it, which is the substance, the essence, the form, the quid est, the what is, and that allows us to communicate rationally in thought and communicate thoughts back and forth without having to show everything physically, graphically, because we can grasp, this is called the apprehension, we have the capacity to grasp the essence of things. No other species can do that. Gets a little philosophical here, but it's true. So form follows function means the structure of the thing is according to the function of the thing. Very special when we get to the proper functioning of the different organs of the body, and when we do an analysis of the sexual organs and the proper or improper function of those organs, according to nature, without having to talk about God, faith, religion. No, this is nature. Nature tells us something. Okay, that's observing nature. All right. So all this background to say that in reproduction, the function, right, functionally, and it's good for you to train to think functionally. It's about passing on preservation of the species, always a big picture. It's the preservation of the species from generation to generation. Then mechanically, at the molecular level, DNA. At the cellular level, either meiosis or mitosis. You see? I'm still staying at the functional level. In other words, I'm putting the structure in relation to its function, passing on the genetic information. Imagine, we're talking about the cannonball. The capsule of inheritance is passed on in this microscopic molecule that if we were to take out, you know, chromatin, you heard chromatin, hopefully, right? Is the wad of DNA inside a nucleus that is not undergoing mitosis, a nucleus that is functioning in interphase. If we were to take out a chromatin from a single nucleus of our cells, of the trillions of cells that we have, and stretch it out here hypothetically in front of us, how long will it go? DNA. So you know that chromatin is a single molecule, right? It's called a macromolecule. It's one of the 4 macromolecules in the categories. What are the other 3? Boom, boom, boom. Carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and then nucleic acids, all right? Okay, this is so obvious, you forgot already. No, it's there. It always goes back to molecular, guys. All right, so if we were to stretch out one chromatin from one nucleus of one of my cells, and how long would it be? Remember, it's microscopic, super microscopic, because it's inside a microscopic nucleus of a microscopic cell. Would it be a few millimeters, a few centimeters, a few? Exactly, 6 feet, 2 meters. 2 meters. That's very significant. You know, this is 1 meter. A yard, 3 feet, if an average more or less is the arm length, chest length. All right, that's 1 meter. So it's 2 of us, like that. Huge. How do you fit that into the nucleus of a cell? How? Well, that's also compaction, but that's molecular compaction, not cellular compaction. All right? And it's the coiling and the supercoiling. You heard about supercoiling, hopefully, yeah? You heard about the nucleosome, getting into the structure of the DNA. It's according to the function. That DNA, because how long is it? How many base pairs? You can cheat. It's open book. 3 times 10 to the 9, 3 billion base pairs, right, for the human genome. 3 billion. That was precisely, you told me you heard about the Human Genome Project. Well, that was the product of the Human Genome Project. 10 years, 12 years to get 3 billion base pairs in sequence, in the proper sequence, not mashed up like in the blender. Exactly. And so these 3 billion base pairs actually make up 6 feet or 2 meters of length when uncoiled down to the nucleosome level, all right? So the DNA has to compact, and it winds around the nucleosome 1.7 times, almost to 7 times, and then shoots out, and another winding, and so forth. But then that structure, which is the tertiary, that's already the quaternary structure of DNA, coils on itself again. Think of a rubber band that is being twisted in opposite ends, right? It starts coiling on itself. It's still the same length as a whole, but it's coiling on itself which forms the intermediate structure, the 30 nanometer structure. Don't worry about these details, but I'm just telling you what's in the textbooks. And then that coils upon itself again, and you start getting a fiber type of structure. And further, then you get into the 200 nanometer fiber, which is, again, diameters. And finally, you get into the final structure that is super coiled, and it's exactly called supercoiling. And the compaction level is about how many folds do you think it is at the very end of the day? Give an 100 in the hundreds, okay. Just by in the orders of magnitude. Who says it's in the dozens of range of magnitude, the folds? Like for example, if I fold this, that's a 2-fold, right? That's a 4-fold. Right, that's an 8-fold. In other words, if I were to cut around the edges here, I would have 8 little pieces of paper, right? That's 8-fold. Okay, for DNA, you say it's in hundreds fold. Anyone else? Hundreds, thousands, dozens, folding. 6 feet down to super microscopic. Okay, dozens, hundreds, thousands. Anyone for thousands? Yeah, it's more intuitive, yeah. Yeah, it's about 10,000 fold, about 10,000 compaction. Yeah, you're in the order of magnitude at least. You're in the order of magnitude, right? Yeah, because think about it. So this was 8, right? That's 16 fold, 32 fold. What follows 32? 64. Give you an A right now if you can just fold that again. And you're done. Okay, so that's 64 folds. Imagine to get this down to 10,000. But that's the level of compaction, and that's why most of DNA is what? Shut down most of the time, and that's important. Why? That's essential. It's deviating, but I want you to think functionally and structurally. Very, very important in the profession. Why is that compaction so important? That the DNA really, when you fold 2 meters of DNA down to 10,000 times, is super coiled, and it's essentially shut down. What's in that 3 billion base pairs? If I take a cell from my skin, 2 meters. If I take a cell from my liver, 2 meters. Neuron, 2 meters. Choose a cell, except for mature RBC, which doesn't have a nucleus, okay? Any cell in the body, specialized, fully differentiated. 3 billion base pairs, the same code, right? Same code. So where's the rub? Imagine if the DNA would all be open to express, right? The central dogma, the canonical dogma, right? Transcription, translation. Well, all the 20,000 genes would be expressing all the time in every cell, and we really wouldn't have differentiation. It's only very few narrow range of genes that are expressed in each different cell of the body. So the liver cells are doing liver things, and the neuron cells are doing neuron things, you see? And that's what we call differentiation, functional differentiation. And that's why most of the DNA in most of the cells has to be shut down most of the time. And only a little tiny range open up, pried open by the, what? The transcription machinery, right? The polymerases and all, they get in there and they wedge that guy open to express those few genes that are needed to do the function of that particular cell. That's what we call differentiation, functionally. So that's why DNA has to be compacted, really. And de-differentiation, that's what Yamanaka did with the Vertiv IPS, right? The induced pluripotent stem cells. He took back differentiated cells, fully differentiated cells, back to the pluripotent stage. He undifferentiated those cells. Super artificial, that doesn't happen in nature. We've never seen it in nature, but he did it in the lab, Yamanaka. Got him the Nobel Prize, et cetera, and that's one of the alternatives for stem cell research is the iPS cells, okay? We'll get to that one later on. Anyway, so functionally reproduction is about passing on the inheritance information to the next generation so that the progeny comes out of the same species, that the parents, or single parent in the case of asexual reproduction. And that's quite astonishing that each generation, each F generation comes out the same species. All right? Everything mechanically and functionally that has to happen for that to occur. All right, then the two modes of reproduction, okay. Again, energetically here, asexual, I told you asexual is less energy. So that's the good part of it. It's easier to do, but the downside is that it doesn't have what? Any substantial variation, and therefore they're essentially clones. As far as the environment, so long as the environment stays about the same, you know, the environmental conditions stay the same, that's fine. The species that are surviving are likely to continue surviving on the same environment. But if the environment starts changing even a little bit, like for instance seasonally, going from liquid water to solid water in the middle of summer, in the middle of winter, up north or way down south, then that might be a fluctuation that requires more variation. And asexual may not cut it. So sexual reproduction is the other alternative, which is energetically how much more expensive? On average, twice as much expensive, all right, because of the production of gametes actually and all that that entails. But it allows for variation, okay, a range. So that's when you get into quantitative traits. Remember Dr. Moll and quantitative traits? Okay, so it's a range. Very simple example. Give me an example of quantitative trait in the human. Fast, super, easy. Come on. Height. We all line up here. We're all going to have certain different heights. We can take the average of us all, you know, and so forth. And when you expand this to the general population of humans, there's an average height for men and for women at particular age, because that's going to vary by age, okay? And then there's going to be variations on that height, and typically it's normalized. The typical variations in nature are normalized, the bell-shaped curve, known as Gaussian, etc., right? And the tails are on the edges. But those tails may be at a disadvantage or disadvantage if the environment changes. Okay? And so that's the, and so where's the variation is at two levels in sexual reproduction, all right? Which two levels are those? Give you a hint. One is at the molecular level, the other one is at the organismal level, which gets compacted, if you will, to the cellular level. Okay, the molecular level, you told me, crossing over, recombination, right, in meiosis. And the other one? No, because mutations can also happen in asexual, and that's more random. But simply the very nature of sexual reproduction requires how many sexes? Two sexes. It's a binary system. It's the minimal number necessary for having what kind of mix? Give me a number. 50% mix, right? Come on. The egg comes from one individual, the sperm comes from another individual of the same species, but the specific genome, you know, the variations will be there. I mean, it could be a super tall woman, super tall wife, and a super short husband, right? They're off the norm, they're off the norm, but they're still human. If everything else is in place, they could be sexually productive, they can fertile, all right? So their child is going to have 50% mix from the father, 50% mix from the mother, automatically. So that's why I say the other one is at the organismal level, meaning the husband and wife, but it concentrates, if you will, at the gametes, at the cellular level of the specific gamete, the specific sperm of that husband who's going to fertilize that specific egg of that wife, okay, whatever that genome is bringing. So again, there's mix there. So for the double expense, the double advantage of variation. Okay, moving forward, the chromatic reduction again is this essentially 2n going to n. You could have just drawn that 2n with an arrow n. Chromatic reduction is reducing from diploid to haploid, all right, or getting rid of the pairs, and that's why in meiosis you notice from a single cell, a single mother cell or progenitor cell, we end up with how many cells in meiosis? How many daughter cells? In contrast with mitosis. With mitosis, how many daughter cells? Two daughter cells. But in meiosis, 4, because there's a double. Okay, there's a double split, and the chromatic reduction occurs precisely when? In meiosis 1 or 2? Meiosis 2, the second split, right? When those two finally, when the pair of chromosomes finally unpair, going to the opposite poles of the what is going to become the 4 daughter cells, all right? Either the 4 sperm or the 4 eggs, or the 3 eggs, the 1 egg and the 3 polar bodies. That's why it's also important to have those polar bodies to get rid of, to do the reduction, the chromatic reduction. So you see structural and functionally at that level, all right? Gametogenesis essentially is the production of the sex cells known as gametes, and automatically you just say there are 2 types of gametogenesis. There's oogenesis and there's spermatogenesis, because we need to produce the 2 complementary cells. All right? So you see, very succinct, but really focused. Haploid diploid, explain what that is all about. You can just put 2n, 1n, where n is the number of chromosomes for each species, for example. All right? Always lowercase. That's just a convention, because n in a capital letter represents what? Typically the number in a population, the number of organisms or number of things, typically organisms in a population, number of individuals in a population. So for haploid and diploid, n is always a lowercase. That's the convention, right? Chromosomes, well, you could have told me for the human there are 23 pairs, or of which 22 are autosomes. The one is the sex pairs, and the male-female thing, XY, etc. 20,000 genes, 3 billion base pairs. So I'm looking for data, right? Fertilization, the process of restoring diploidy, fusion of gametes, and result is a zygote, then zygote, all right, 2n, the diploidy has been restored, the first cell of the new individual, etc. Totipotent, sort of syngamy is what completes fertilization at the nuclear level. What nuclear we're talking about? The fusion of the 2 pronuclei, the male and female pronuclei. So it's very important. Syngamy completes fertilization. You're going to go into medical schools that not necessarily, that here you're going to see ideology trumping biology, and I don't mean to pun with that, okay? You're going to see increasingly in textbooks, in biology textbooks, in medical textbooks, where ideology filters in to redefine biology. So that in some books you'll find, oh no, fertilization is not complete until implantation, which happens in the human 5 to 7 days later. Okay, that's totally ideological. With all due respect, it has 0 foundation in the science. It has 0 foundation in the nature, because fertilization is the process of fusion of gametes. By definition, a fertilized egg is no longer an egg, because an egg is haploid. But fertilized, now we have a zygote, which again, by definition, is diploid. All right, so fertilization has ended, finished, done, kaput, and it's time to move on with the new individual. And that's just nature, whether we are interested in it or not. But, you know, mark my words, because you run into this with full force. Okay, the morula, I told you the origin of the word and so forth. That's just for edification. I think that etymology, the meaning, the origin and meaning of the words is very important and symbolic. It's meaningful because these are typically nouns, right? They tell us the substance of the thing. But the important thing about the morula is that it's a further stage from the zygote. Development is already occurring, or at least cell division, but it's mitosis. Okay? Mitosis cannot occur before fertilization. In fact, in evolution, we talk about pre-zygotic and post-zygotic influence, evolutionary influence. So this watershed, the limitation between the new individual and no individual is set in stone for nature, and not for that. We don't, it's not a question of belief. All right, so a couple of important things about the morula. First of all, is that it's several cells, and the cells are undergoing a geometric progression, geometric mitosis, all right, duplicating at every iteration, and also that each cell, which is known as a blastomere, is totipotent, totipotent, which is also the zygote. So that if we disaggregate a morula, what would you expect to get? Let's say we are at the 8-cell stage of a morula. Okay, so how many blastomeres do we have inside that zona pellucida? 8-cell stage. 8. 8-cell stage. There's 8 cells inside this morula, all right, within the zona pellucida. And I disaggregate that morula. In other words, somehow I dissolve the zona pellucida, or I do microsurgery and expose the 8 cells, the 8 blastomeres. What's the potency of those blastomeres? Totipotent. What are the 4 levels of potency? Tori, pluri, multi, which is within particular organ systems, right? And then fully differentiated. They're doing their stuff in whatever organ system those cells reside. So morula, blastomeres, totipotent. I disaggregate a morula. What do I end up with? Potentially 8 zygotes. 8 zygotes, which each one of those 8 potentially could develop into a human being. I didn't invent this. You can go back to Hans Spemann. You can Google it if you want. Spemann is the one who was doing this in frog embryos 100 years ago, okay, early 1900s. And he's the one who was one of the big proponents and scientists for embryonic development and that whole scenario of cellular differentiation. And that's been noted in all the vertebrates, this totipotency of the morula. But then by the time we hit blastocyst, what happens? It's actually the first level of differentiation. This actually gets into the lecture, so I'm going to go into that better late than never. Okay, so just to review what we're talking about, the compaction here is at the cellular level, meaning that these structures maintain the same overall diameter, okay, or radius or circumference, whatever, but there's cellular division going on within the zona pellucida here, and therefore the cells are compacting. In other words, there are more cells with less cytoplasm, each one inside, okay, maintaining the number. So imagine that within 24 hours, we have the first cell division. Within 48 hours, we already have 2 or 3 more divisions. So it could be 8 or 16. It's hard for me to tell if these are 8 or 16, probably 8, I'm not sure. At any rate, at some point we get the morula, which is still totipotent, so on. Then blastocyst, okay? So what do we have in the blastocyst? Well, it turns out that there is the beginning of 2 cell layers, all right? The outer cell, which is called a trophoblast, and there's a mass of cells on the inside of the blastocele, all right? There's a coelom, in other words, a coelom is a cavity. Is this cavity filled with air? No, how's the air gonna get in there? No, it's full of fluid, right? It's full of fluid, but it's a cavity. So on the inside of that cavity, there's this little mass of cells. On the inside of the cavity is a mass of cells, and without much ado, it's just called inner cell mass, also referred to as the embryoblast at times. Why embryoblast? Because the whole embryo will actually develop from here. Okay, the next stage was going to be the gastrula. The 3 germ layers are going to come from here. So this is what becomes the embryonic disc, and so on and so forth. So that the inner cell mass will become the embryo proper. For whatever mammal. This is mammalian model, and okay. And so ICM for short. And what happens to the outer layer cells? Again, functionally, because it's in the outside, that's the one that's going to have direct contact with the placenta, right? The endometrium. So what do you think is logical for that to do, to develop into what organ? Exactly, the placenta. Well, the placenta. So the trophoblast will become the placenta as it interacts with the mother, all right, from tissue to organ. And the ICM will become the embryo. Standard for whatever mammal we look at, including the human. Okay. Remember I talked about hatching. I don't know if you picked that up earlier, but there's a process whereby eventually that blastocyst comes out of the zona pellucida, because that zona pellucida now is a hindrance. It was a protection up until this point, while what was the embryo doing? What was the early embryo doing? The early embryo was traveling, right? It was traveling from the ampulla to the endometrium to the uterus, right? So there's a travel there, and even though organically it's a short distance, all right, when the embryo is microscopic, that is a humongous distance if you put it proportionally to the embryo, okay? That's equivalent to miles and miles of travel for a normal-sized human being. And so that's held by 2 motions that I'll explain in a minute. But at some point when the blastocyst is about to embed into the endometrium, there is a hatching of sorts. For mammals, we're not talking birds here. So the good thing is that the zona pellucida is not fully calcified like an eggshell, because otherwise that little embryo couldn't come out. In contrast with the oviduct of the chicken, where the zona pellucida essentially becomes hardened with calcium, and you have a hard shell so that the chicken lays the egg, and there's no hatching until later. Okay, but here the hatching occurs inside, internally. And then apposition is just coming, the blastocyst coming up to the epithelium. This is a caricature of the epithelial cells of the endometrium, all right, which was rotated 90 degrees from the normal vertical position. And here is a very complex biochemical interaction that is occurring for this implantation to occur, because this embryo, again, let's go genetically for a moment. What's the genetic composition of this embryo vis-a-vis the mother's genome, the mother's DNA? Does the embryo have maternal DNA? Yes or no? Let me say yes. Let me say no. Not sure? Oh, the rest don't care. No. Yeah, the embryo comes from womb, from the zygote, right? And the zygote comes from the mom and the dad, right? The egg came from the mom, the sperm came from the dad. Therefore, yeah, this embryo has, its DNA is, give me a percentage. How much? 50% maternal. 50% identical. It's a semi-clone, if you will. 99? Not yet. I know the Y chromosome is disappearing, but it's not that drastic yet. We'll still have something to say about it. So yeah, you see, 50%, that 50% is 100% compatible with the mother, okay? So that to the mother is another self. It's a self-tissue, but only 50% is a self-tissue. The other 50% of that embryo genetically comes from where? Obviously the father, which is not the mother, and therefore it is incompatible, and it's equivalent to a transplant. but it's like a chimeric transplant. It's a mixed transplant where half of the tissue of that transplant has the DNA of the recipient, but the other half doesn't. So do you immunosuppress or not? Clinical question. You have to, otherwise it's going to be rejected. I'm talking about an organ transplant, liver, kidney, you name it, right? You have to immunosuppress the patient because the kidney has at least 50%. I mean, putting a hypothetical case, it doesn't happen in life. You know, the kidney necessarily is 100% from another person. So definitely have to immunosuppress. Well, the epithelium is going to immunosuppress this thing because it's 50% incompatible, which is significant. So the embryo has to fool the endometrium into thinking, oh no, it's okay, just concentrate on the good half, on my good half. Don't concentrate on my bad half, okay, on my incompatible half. Concentrate on my compatible half and don't kick me out, because if you kick me out, that's going to be a spontaneous abortion. Right? Okay, so you see here then that the trophoblast starts embedding into the endometrium, and it changes name then. It's called synthesial trophoblast. Don't worry too much technicality, but it's expanding and it's highly, these cells are growing very fast, actively mitotically invading the whole endometrium of the mother. What are they looking for? Because the yolk has already been consumed, nutrients, and where's the nutrient going to be? They're not just digesting, you know, these are not cannibalizing, it's not a parasite. That's another reason why it's not a parasite, okay? These cells are not parasitizing the tissue of the mom. In other words, they're not digesting the endometrium and eating it up, coupling it up, phagocytosis. No, they're looking for what? Connecting with capillaries. Connecting with capillaries of the mother. There's the food, there's the nourishment. And by the way, it's not only food, it's also going to be my sewer system. It's going to get rid of my toxins, including CO2, from cellular respiration, which is happening galore here because these cells are very actively dividing. So it's looking for capillaries, and the capillaries allow themselves to be integrated into the placenta. So where's the parasitism? You see, and that's another ideology. It's a you can compare it to a parasite. If you don't want it, you don't need that parasite inside of you. This is the analogy that floats in medical schools with MDs and professors with full credentials. Okay, I'm just you call the shots, you make the judgment. But where's the parasitism in establishing a communication, a capillary communication? All right. Okay, forward, because just you can tell that I enjoy embryology. All right, the next stage, of course, the Gastrula stage, further differentiation is occurring so that we end up with the 3 germ layers, the very 3 famous germ layers, all right? And again, they're just unimaginatively named. The outermost one is going to be ectoderm, and the innermost endo, and the middle meso, right? Okay. Now, outer and inner and middle are still within the gastrula structure, all right? So don't put that ectoderm on the outside of the embryo, somehow floating on the epithelial wall of the endometrium or something like that. You know, there's an integration here. So it's within this double cavity, if you will, that it's called the embryonic disc, okay? That the embryonic disc develops. That was the ICM. All right. In other words, there's a second hollow that happens, if you will, in the inner cell mass. Within the inner cell mass, there's another cavity that develops, which is the amniotic cavity, different from the coelom that is down here. Okay. And so now you got 2 cavities to deal with, and the little sandwich in between, otherwise known as the embryonic disc, that's what develops into the 3 germ layers. And from the 3 germ layers develop all of the organs and systems of the body, okay? The one that I always like to point out is the nervous system, because what is the most obvious system that develops from the ectoderm? Ecto, outer, the skin, otherwise known as the integumentary system, right? The integument, And it's actually a system because it's got glands, it's got layers, it's got epidermis, it's got dermis. Well, first it got a whole layer of dead cells that are very important there to protect from IUV and other toxins and stuff. Okay, then you got epiderm, then you got epithelial cells, then you got the dermis, conjunctive tissue, you got glands in there, you got sweat glands, you got oil glands, you get the nerve endings, you get the hair follicles, the whole structure of the hair follicles, muscles, the villi and all that. Anyway, ectoderm, skin. But what is our inmost system of the body structurally? If you go, let's say, either head or the rest of the body, it's more obvious on the head. First we hit hair, then we hit skin, then we keep going in further. We're eventually going to hit muscle, right? And then eventually going to hit bone, and then the brain, nervous tissue. And then there's the brain, and then down the spinal cord, down the center of the vertebrae goes down the spinal column, all right? And then ganglia and so forth. So what is our innermost system? The nervous system. The nervous system or the neural system is our innermost system, right? Structurally in the body. But the neural system comes from the ectoderm. The ectoderm. Yeah, from the ectoderm. From the ectoderm. And so it's fascinating, this process of pouring in these cells, that's why these little arrows, you know, these arrows, those cells pour in like that, literally, into the mesoderm and start establishing the axis, the apical axis from the head to the tail, and then the front part will start developing the encephalons, which will be the brain eventually, and then the spinal cord, which will then get encased by bone, all right, from the mesoderm. But that pouring in is called an invagination. Is that pouring in, and it's fascinating to watch in time-lapse photography. At any rate, this is a photomicrograph of a gastrula, the embryonic disc, or the embryonic plate, if you will. Here's a neural groove pouring in, and then here already it's a little further advanced. You have the folds on each side bilaterally, right? And then already forming the neural tube here, which will be surrounded by mesoderm, bone, and then muscles. The ectoderm continues on the outside, and then the endoderm will form mostly the internal organs of the digestive tract and other organs in the gut area. Okay. So we have all these stages which have been classified now classically for medicine, the Carnegie stages of human development, okay? Carnegie stages up to 23 stages, which don't correspond exactly to days, right, the numbering, but rather significant events that happen in the embryonic development. From the zygote, which is day 1 and stage 1, all the way to the 8-week embryo, which is stage number 23. And significant things happen along the way, either internally or externally, including a primitive tail, which is then reabsorbed in, and the only thing that we have left of that primitive tail is the vestigial bones inside of what? Of the coccyx, little, otherwise known as the tailbone. If ever you fell your tailbone, you know it's there because it hurts a lot. You just leave it alone, it will heal in its own, but that's a vestige, reabsorption of the primitive tail, which phylogenetically connects us with other mammals that have a functional tail. So at this stage of 8 weeks, all of the organs and systems are in place, but miniature. All of the organs and systems, a dozen organ systems also, depending on how you classify them, are in place and functionally more or less, all right, but in miniature, because this whole embryo is about 1 inch long, from head to tail, literally, all right, 1 inch long, miniature. And so from then forward, it's mostly growth and development, but the bulk of the differentiation, of cellular differentiation, has occurred into organ systems. Follow me? Well, it doesn't ever really stop, but the bulk of it is done by the 8th week. By the 8th week, or 2 months in to the pregnancy, all right? The little embryo is about 1 inch long, and then it changes name significantly into fetus, which again in Latin means tiny bean. Fetus, fetus, means tiny bean in Latin. And from then on, it's mostly cellular growth, again in this geometric fashion of duplication. But because at that point we have so many cells in each organ system, literally thousands or maybe millions of cells, probably thousands, each time they duplicate, each time those cells undergo mitosis, then that organ duplicates in size. You follow me? And so it's a very rapid progression that occurs from the 8th month, from the 2nd month to the 9th month. And so I told you earlier, I did the calculation one time. Here in the following 7 months, the embryo grows from 1 inch in size to about 1.5 feet, which is the average length of a baby, of a human baby at birth. Okay, 1.5 feet. All right, so that's what, 15 inches, right? No, 18 inches. From 1 inch to 18 inches, 18 times its original size, to the fully developed fetus ready for delivery. Overall, if we look at starting from the zygote, which is about, I think it's about 10 microns, is it, in diameter, a human egg, or same size as a zygote, to the 1.5 feet baby, that overall growth is about 5,000 times bigger if you do the math on it, all right? About 5,000 times, which is just amazing, bewildering if you consider, someone did the calculation, if one were to continue that rate of growth after birth, you know, we would become a humongous building of several tons of size and weight if we will continue at that same rate. So obviously at birth, everything has to slow down a lot, a lot, to the point that we only grow on average about 5 to 6 times more for the rest of our lives. Okay. And even that is done in the next 20 years or so. And then after a while, I've started shrinking already, really. My clothes is now getting big. It used to be, now my clothes is big because I'm starting to shrink after about 50 or 60. Yeah, and again, it's a physiological thing. What happens? Loss of? So what's keeping our size more or less? What maintains our, mostly the bone structure, the skeletal structure that we have, you know, the skull. So if we start losing bone, right, start losing calcium, we start shrinking in size. Happens more to women than to men. And then the vertebrae start collapsing also because loss of bone. And what happens? Then they start hunching forward and leaning forward because the vertebrae are collapsing and they're collapsing forward. And so you're getting this wedge effect throughout the column. All right. So bone, supplement, very important, the calcium and so forth, so that you can more or less maintain your height for some time. Okay, differentiation. What I'm trying to show here is that gradual differentiation is certainly a one-way street from the zygote to whatever fetus or embryo is going to be born or hatch after full gestation or full embryonic development, all right? It's a one-way gradual differentiation from totipotency to fully differentiated cells. And we keep a few of the stem cells within us. They're known as adult stem cells to help for regeneration and repair of organ systems. And that is across the same for all of the vertebrates. Okay, this gradual but real one-way differentiation from totipotency to fully differentiated. In any species that we see of the vertebrates, we see the same basic pattern from a single cell that is totipotent, diploid across to trillions of cells of fully differentiated cells, organs and tissues ready to face the world, face the environment, and try to make a go at survival, okay, into the open environment. Wow, 12:05, I can't believe it. So, give me a couple minutes, please, if you don't mind, because at this point I can't get into the, I can't afford one more lecture. I want to now expand into the bioethics of it and look at what is known as the ontological status of the human embryo. Okay, ontological, ontos means being. What is the being status? What are we? Okay, the ontological status, because this actually will define where we stand on a number of controversial issues throughout professional life and even our personal life and relationships. And not only at the beginning of life, but also at the end of life, okay, at the end of human life. So what is the ontological status of the human embryo at the zygote level? So I'm taking it all the way down to that fertilized egg, okay, the zygote. Is it a human life? You know, okay, so we can ask the question, is the zygote alive? Well, if the zygote is not alive, it's not going to develop, right? So the zygote to continue normal development has to be alive, so it's alive. What kind of life is it? Well, life is a substantive and human is a qualifier. If it's not human, then what kind of life? You notice that there is no unspecific life on Earth. Okay, what do I mean by that? No unspecific life on Earth. What do I mean by that? Never has been discovered anyway. Literally the blob, you know, the living blob. In other words, any species, any organism that we see on Earth, whether macroscopic or microscopic, belongs to a particular species, genetically, biologically, naturally. So there's no unspecific living blob going around on Earth that we have discovered yet. Okay? Every living organism belongs to a particular species. So why should we be different? Why should the human zygote not be human? It's pretty obvious that the human zygote is human by virtue of 23 pairs, the 23 pairs of chromosomes of the human chromosomes. Individual, yeah, it's individual because that's one zygote right there. Okay, human being, well, this is kind of philosophical. Being, it just means thing. It's a human thing, it's a human being. In other words, defined genetically by the 23 pairs of chromosomes that are human. This one, the person, is the one that is challenged. Philosophically and also legally and politically and everywhere else. Because by the Constitution, persons are protected in the US Constitution. And then it's country by country. But in the United States, born people are also legal persons. So we are anthropologically a person, but we're also legally a person. And legal persons are protected by the Constitution so that innocent legal persons may not be killed. You know, it's illegal to kill a legal person. Okay? Self-defense is a different story. But killing an innocent legal person is illegal. It's a crime. It's a legal crime. So the whole thing is person, but that's legal. How about anthropologically, you know, and ontologically? Well, person, it turns out that person comes from the Greek prosopon, the word prosopon, which means mask, the mask. In Greek theater, classical Greek theater, and I just showed some pictures here of many masks, but classical Greek theater going back almost 3,000 years ago, 2,500, the time of Aristotle and Plato and these famous philosophers, it was representing their Greek mythology, and they would use masks to represent the different gods. And typically it was only one protagonist, one actor, who had a huge voice, typically a male, who projected the voice into the amphitheater, which, by the way, were designed very well architectonically, because one could stand here and talk. I've actually been in one of these in Greece. You can talk here and they can hear you out here. That's what they're doing here. These people are talking and these people are hearing what they're saying, and there ain't no microphone here, okay? So they're very well designed so that the sound wave amplifies like that, like a natural megaphone. But you still need a potent voice to do that, but it can be done. At any rate, a single actor would put on the mask of the different gods or goddesses, whatever they were representing in the stage, in the play, all right? And so the mask represents the person. That's where it comes from, prosopon. And the mask simultaneously reveals and conceals. It would reveal for the audience, it would reveal the the protagonist, whoever was being portrayed, Zeus or Jupiter or Mercury or Venus, whatever goddess or god was presented in the play, but it would conceal at the same time the actor, because it's not the actor that's important, it's the protagonist, it's the people in the play. So the mask simultaneously conceals and reveals, like our faces. I make the analogy to the face, the countenance, the human countenance. We as humans have one of the most expressive faces in the animal kingdom. We can express a lot of sentiments and emotions and feelings and even thoughts by our faces. They say that the eyes are the window to the soul, right? To the interior, because the eyes reveal a lot, and that's why we can shut our eyes. One of the reasons, but the face represents a lot. At the same time, we can express emotions with our face, but no one really knows what's in my heart, okay? Even if we're looking at each other, we can also, our thoughts are still private. And so the face, the human face, simultaneously reveals and conceals. What does that mean? That at the end of the day, it's a mystery. The human person is a mystery, really, okay? And so from that perspective, my personal opinion is that the zygote is the best one to be a person, because is revealing his or her humanity by virtue of being a human zygote, fertilized by human egg and a human sperm with all the genetic code necessary, the human genome. But at the same time, being a single cell doesn't really have the shape of a born human, all right? So it doesn't look like what we're used to looking at human beings, all right? And so it's concealing his or her humanity. At the same time, it's revealing and concealing simultaneously. And that's why, from that perspective, in my opinion, the zygote does deserve to be considered human person, because it fits the definition of prosopon, revealing and concealing simultaneously. Of course, that's very different from the utilitarian perspective that the Supreme Court took in 1973 when they legalized abortion, right? Very, very different perspective. But, okay, so I put it there. Unfortunately, I'm short of time, so we're going to have to do then the first hot topic, which will be abortion, for Monday. I send you the PowerPoint anyway. It's a draft, so sometimes I will add some things, all right? But the one that I send you after the lecture, that's the one that's closed out. So basically what you can do on this lecture then is just finish the other half of the page, and we'll get to it. It'll all come out in the wash sooner or later, one way or another, okay? But I'm just taking this extra time to set the ground without having to talk about God, faith, or religion at all, the ground based on nature, on the examination of the embryonic process, to grant humanity to the human embryo. Because that's going to then make a big difference when we start looking at the issues, right? It's going to be a big difference how we stand on the issues. Thank you for your patience. I'm sorry I went over for 10 minutes, but I just had to get this finished.
This Sunday, we're just finishing the...
Yeah, the other half of that original page, or will be the first half of this one page. Either way.
I already finished, so you have that one from me.
Yeah, I don't know if you, well, yeah, but yeah, you actually gave me everything. Yeah. So you don't want to change anything? You think you're good with whatever? Maybe, yeah, you know what? It was going to be missing this last part, the ontological status. I'm going to need that.
Ontological status?
Yeah.
No,
the one
that one was on the...
You did it? You know, I just didn't look at it. I put it 2 lines. I didn't actually read it. But, okay, so if you're good with that, yeah. I'll take what you gave me.
Okay.
All right? That's fine. Mm-hmm. Okay, you're welcome. Thank you, folks. And I apologize. I don't like to go over because I want to be respectful of the time, okay? All right, so let me close this, and then I'll send you this.